Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Inga Diederich, a former Ph.D. student at the University of California in San Diego, to talk about notions of blood purity as it existed in Korea in the Cold War and beyond. Inga, thanks for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you talk about one aspect of the history of modern Korea, particularly this notion of binational South Korean identity. Can you just sort of start by laying the foundation for what is the context of this topic, and can you provide a little more detail as to what you mean by this term of binational South Korean identity?
Right. Thank you for the question. You're starting in with the toughest one, laying out the most basic kind of foundational issue in my research. So I think probably the most basic way to lay it out is, every country has a sense of itself, right? What does it mean to be, for us, what does it mean to be American? And in the United States, we predicate a lot of our identity or our sense of ourselves as a nation, as a people, on our kind of like immigrant constitution, on our immigrant identity, our diversity, the fact that we bring in people from many different places. In other countries, that's not necessarily the case, right? Countries without a history of immigration. And in Korea, in the modern era, a lot of the sense of Korean identity is really predicated on the notion that Koreans are an ethnically homogenous people, monoethnic, shared race, and there are specialized terms that have developed in modern Korean history to describe this sense of homogeneity. So the two big ones in the 20th century have been a term, 단일 민족, 단일 meaning like single, 민족 meaning nation, but very like a racialized sense of nation. So a singular racial people, right? And then there's another term, kind of the ideology of this single racism, right? Is 일민주의, which is like single people-ism or the one people-ism, right? And so for me personally, my interest in exploring, like, when did this sense of attachment to the idea that Koreans are homogenous and racially distinct, when did it develop? My interest in that really comes from a personal place. I myself am half Korean, so I kind of straddle this litmus line of what is Korean, what is not Korean, in a way that can fall one way or another way. And so I wanted to explore, like, where did that line come from? How does it develop? And so my research kind of explores both the notion of the Korean race and its historical development, but very particularly I focus on the 20th century because I think there's a turning point as you move from the colonial period in Korea, Japanese colonization of Korea, which lasted until 1945, into the Cold War, so-called liberated period of the divided Koreas. When you get these new scientific technologies that allow people to take what had previously been a fairly like symbolic notion of the Korean people and turn it into a more kind of biological notion. So once you start to get more medical technologies to examine and really intervene in the body in very intimate ways, these notions of like, we are a single people, we are a single race, all of a sudden can be scientized, right? You can put the force of biology behind it by saying, like, what is biologically distinct and unique about Korean hair, Korean skin, or in the case of my research, Korean blood, right? What is it that sets us apart physically from other people? And how can we use these physical characteristics to defend the integrity of the Korean national body against outside pollution. So that's kind of what I mean by bionational. Like national broadly can mean many things, but bionational I use to mean specifically this body-based sense, this biology-based sense of race and racial identity.
And for some of the listeners in the audience, when they hear you talk about this, a term that might ring in their heads is eugenics. And
Mm.
you do talk about this in your research. And in particular, there's one part where you mentioned how the Korean War period was particularly important for this formulation of uh, this idea of eugenics. Can you talk about how this period was important?
No, that's a fantastic question, and I do kind of want to prelude this a little bit by saying, I know your podcast is the What is Asia podcast, and you're concerned with speaking not just to specialists but to non-specialists of Asia, right? Kind of reaching out across these borders. And I think with eugenics, especially, it's a great topic for that because one of the interesting things about it is it really doesn't have the word itself doesn't necessarily have the same stigma in Asia that it does in the West, right? Because in the West, we really associate eugenics with perhaps a little ahistorically, but we associate it almost exclusively with the Nazis and with eugenics, concentration camps, and genocide. And, although this isn't historically true, there's a widespread fantasy that the West really washed its hands of eugenics and put it aside after World War II ended. In Asia, because eugenics doesn't necessarily have that history, and because the broader Asian populations, like the broader Korean population, is not necessarily as familiar with that Western history, it doesn't have the same baggage, it doesn't have the same ring. The word itself in, say, Korean, the way it's translated into Korean, and the same Chinese characters are used across East Asia, so same meaning in Japan and in China. Wutheng is really just like a positive or a more advanced kind of life, right? So what eugenics means for Korea in general is really just practices to optimize the individual body, and in optimizing the individual body, optimizing the prospects of the nation overall. So there's this kind of sense in, say, like the 1940s, the 1950s, which you asked about. If you can encourage sanitary practices, hygienic practices, reproductive practices that will improve bodies, that will produce healthier babies, that will produce stronger mothers, fitter soldiers, smarter school children, why not, right? And in the Korean War, one of the interesting things that happens, for my own research with looking at how blood becomes central to Korean identity and how blood is biologized in Korean identity, is in the Korean War, for the first time in Korean history, you start to have large-scale blood transfusions. Obviously, it's a massive war, massive casualties, both military and civilian. At the time, Korea didn't have an infrastructure to provide all of the blood it needed from domestic sources. So the US, which was really, the largest foreign coordinator or foreign power involved in the Korean War, was importing mass quantities of blood across the Pacific Ocean. There were huge blood drives run by the Red Cross and private hospitals in the United States. Which on the one hand, fantastic, it's saving lives, right? But from Korean doctors' point of view, this is kind of a double-edged sword, because at the very same time that they are being exposed to these transfusion technologies and, the latest military upgrades on how, like, field medics can literally save someone's life with a blood transfusion right there, right on the spot, So like blowing their mind a little bit, this really brutal but amazing on the spot education. At the same time they're being exposed to this, they also have to contend with the fact that none of the blood that is being poured into Korean bodies is actually Korean. And of particular concern is the fact that the US had just kind of turned the corner. The Korean War was the first war with desegregated troops. That also meant, at least hypothetically, this didn't always work out in practice, but at least hypothetically, it was supposed to also be an integrated blood supply. So you have Korean soldiers having black blood transfused into them. And, I've literally read accounts where doctors are saying, if we have black blood transfused into us, are we going to turn black? Right? This is the level of kind of concern that you're dealing with. And so this incites a kind of a panic once the war starts to end about, we need to be able to do these like institutional level blood transfusions on our own. We cannot continue to rely on these foreign networks, not just because it's expensive, not just because it's unreliable, but very specifically because we don't want to continue to run this like biological risk of diluting the eugenic potential of the nation with these transfusions of suspect or potentially racially polluting bloods, right? So that kicks off, another 50 some years of blood organizers trying to figure out like, okay, how do we get Korean blood into Korean bodies? And then even within that, how do we get the best Korean blood? And how do we deal with this formative question of what even is Korean blood? Like when we say we want it, what does that mean, right?
This area of your research that you bring up about sort of trying to set up barriers is interesting because it leads into my next question, which is what kinds of hierarchies were constructed as a result of this conceptualization of pure blood versus non-pure blood? And I know you've alluded to this a little bit, but you've talked about in your research racial hierarchies, but gendered hierarchies. Can you go a little bit more into those? And were there other hierarchies that were constructed around this notion of purity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely. It's one of the kind of the strange things about constructing a community is it seems like it should be a simple project, right? And it's one of the questions we deal with a lot in academia. We use this famous term by a scholar named Benedict Anderson, right? Imagine communities, which talks about how do you draw that line between inside and outside. But then especially grad students and especially scholars, we like to pick apart everything. So even within that line of the imagined community, where are the hierarchies that differentiate like the Platonic ideal of us? The Platonic ideal meaning, this imaginary, perfect subject that everyone aspires to, but no one is ever actually embodying. And what are the hierarchies that kind of descend as you move farther from that, right? And I think in Korea, in terms of this sort of ideal racialized, normative, the expected Korean body, the one that all these experts are imagining in their heads when they're looking for, the markers of the Korean subject, tends to be a few things. Tends to be monoracial, male, and of a certain class. Not necessarily, I mean, upper class is good, but I think, at least like upper middle class, educated. Education is very important. And so in my research, I really focus on three kind of exclusionary tiers that knock people down from this ideal. So I track Koreanness across racial lines, across gendered lines, across class lines. So in my dissertation, one of the things that I focus on is how blood was gendered, for example, how the sense of Koreanness and Korean blood was used. On the one hand, you know, blood was at various points a very female responsibility. From 1910 to 1945, the colonial period, the period of Japanese colonial rule. The same as in the West, blood transfusion had to be conducted in the home, which made it kind of by default a woman's duty. Doctors would go to the house and kind of hit up, like, you know, a wife or a mother or a daughter if a patient, presumably a male patient, needed blood. And so doctors are invoking all of these kind of traditional, like, patriarchal notions of your blood, women's blood, is owed to the male head of the household, right? But then that gets complicated once you move into the post-war period and blood transfusion is institutionalized in networks outside of the house, making women who, for example, these massive black markets for blood develop after the Korean War, where, you know, people who are very desperately poor, all of these war widows who are displaced after the war, one of the ways that they try to support their families is to sell blood to hospitals. And, you know, this creates a lot of anxiety because this is, you know, it is Korean blood coming into the system, but it is poor people's blood, it's women's blood. And it also evokes a lot of the same anxieties that prostitution does, post-war prostitution does, where there's this fear about the morality or the propriety of women selling their bodies, whether that's, you know, through sex or through, like, literally selling parts, you know, of their body. So, you know, there's that on the gendered side. On the class side, you know, the same way, these black markets really continue quite unabated in Korea well into the 1980s. You know, it's one of the things that blood donation advocates really have a hard time contending with. It's very difficult for them to inculcate a sort of a culture of voluntary donation. So they're constantly relying on these black markets where, you know, as I just said, the blood that's coming in is it's racially correct, but it's coming from suspect sources. It's not necessarily being vetted properly. This sort of underground network, this black market network of gangsters and sort of shady private hospitals that don't test the blood correctly. They take blood from people who have given far too many times. So you've got illnesses creeping into the system, like literally contaminated blood that's contaminated with disease. You've got poor people dying. So that's a kind of question as well to me of, you know, how is this blood on the one hand Korean enough, but also not a good enough version of Korean, right? And then, of course, you know, the last question and the one that sort of got me interested in this in the first place is the racial question. So, you know, I also look at mixed race Koreans, who in Korean, the word for a mixed race person is literally a mixed blood person. 혼혈, 혼혈 사람, 혼혈인, 혼혈아. And mixed blood people, you know, race mixing has been in Korea since Korea, you know, before modern Korea existed, during the prior kingdoms of Joseon, Goryeo. You know, there's always been passage across Korean borders with peoples as far away as, you know, the Middle East, as India, as Africa, right? But in the 20th century, because in large part because of Japanese colonization, there's a real kickback against race mixing and a real anxiety about how race mixing might lead to the disappearance of Koreans as a distinct people. And so, after Japanese colonization, when American troops are in Korea, and they've continued to be in Korea since 1945, American troops have never left Korea. And you start to have these mixed race children who, unlike, say, like Japanese Korean mixed children, are very visibly different. You get this narrative that, like, oh, this is a anomaly in Korean history. This is the first time anything like this has happened. And so these children who are like visibly non-Korean, people who say look like me, or who have, that you have these terms about like yellow-haired mixed race children or blue-eyed mixed race children. The range of responses to them is all over the board, from infanticide, child abandonment. You have a rash of so-called lynchings of mixed blood children around American military bases in Korea. So those are, kind of private responses or public responses. Institutionalized responses involve the birth of the famous Korean adoption agencies and movements, which, their inception is really from this goal to get rid of these inconvenient racial bodies who are an affront to this kind of idea of Korean racial purity. And, alongside that, and as part of it, the emergence of a medical and scientific industry devoted to analyzing mixed blood in all of its aspects. Like, how is it biologically different from Korean blood? How are mixed blood persons, like, physically, monitoring eye size, nose size, hair type, skin pigmentation, all the, breaking down the body into its constituent parts in order to show how it is, going back to eugenics, how mixed blood people are a devolution from a normative pure blood ideal. And all of this, it's a two-part project. The whole point of defining mixed blood people in this way is in many ways to shore up and define Korean people. It's easier to define something in some ways through exclusion than by saying what it is. You say what it is not, right? So that's a few of the registers that I'm kind of looking at. But I know that you've discussed this on some of your other interviews. I would like in the future to also reach into the question of sexuality, and I think for my research particular, the AIDS crisis when it hit Korea is going to be a very important thing to look at. So I don't have like hard data on that yet, but if anyone out there is interested in AIDS in Korea, hit me up. I'd love to chat about, sexual minorities in the 90s and kind of how that all contributes to this evolving conversation of national identity.
Just briefly, I wanted to ask about this phenomenon that you discuss in your research about mixed blood schools. What were those and how ubiquitous was this phenomenon in Korea?
Right, that's a fantastic question. So mixed blood schools basically evolve out of necessity. The way that Korean citizenship is conferred is through the father's line. It's patrilineal. So most of the mixed blood children that are born after or during or after the Korean War, usually between American soldiers and Korean women, their fathers are not Korean, their mothers are Korean, which means from a state registration point of view, none of these children are actually Korean citizens, right? Even though they're born in Korea, even though most of them have no contact with their fathers, they have no access to the United States. They're raised speaking Korean and in Korean households. They don't actually have citizen registration numbers. They're not included in family registries. they don't have, kind of, I guess, the equivalent of like social security numbers for us. And as a result, there's no way for them to enter into kind of the normative institutions of childhood. They cannot be registered to go to school, right? And so as a result, you do get some kind of like charitable organizations. These are largely, it should be said, Korean people, very well-meaning Korean people organizing these schools. So you get these institutions that are somewhere between a school and a sort of a halfway house to adoption. Some of these mixed blood schools also serve as kind of like gateways to try to move children towards the adoption industry. But they're essentially charitable outreach. It's you've got these kids who are on the edges of society with no way in, and the schools become a way to like, let's at least get you basic literacy. Let's try to make sure that maybe you have a few meals every day. But yeah, and so they are well-meaning, but at the same time, it's also kind of very interesting narratives that come out of them, because a lot of the doctors and scientists who are very intent on researching, what exactly is this pseudo-Korean body? How do we, mark and measure it? These are basically their data gathering pools, right? And these are the places that they'll go to poke and prod and test their subjects. So you have mixed race people who are interviewed in the 70s recalling their childhood, and they have these very averse reactions to being interviewed again by well-meaning journalists trying to bring their stories to light in the 70s and 80s, and their reaction is pretty uniformly like, stop asking us questions. We spent our entire childhood being questioned and poked and prodded. We don't need any of that anymore. So very kind of like mixed legacy, these schools. But yeah, I mean, it is worth noting, I think, because the history of mixed race in post-war Korea is so kind of dark. It is worth noting that, this kind of charitable impulse on the part of at least some Koreans, right?
And just a couple more questions before we wrap up here. You had just mentioned the word legacy, and this is sort of a question that I like to ask a lot of the guests that I have on. So when talking about bio-national South Korean identity, this notion of purity, what is the legacy of these ideas? How do they still linger today? And how is this phenomenon talked about today in Korea in history books and even just among the general public?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is a very fraught question. It kind of depends on who you ask. I will say, like, for my research in particular, the reactions I get when I tell people like what I study, what my research is about, very widely across the board, depending on generation, depending on political leanings. Some people, if I tell them what I study, it's like, oh my gosh, like you can see a kind of a like light go on. They're like, oh, we are like that. Yeah, we are very kind of like racially purist, I guess, as a people. And then you get some other people like, oh no, you're wrong. That's absolutely not the way that Koreans think today. Maybe back in the day, but today you do hear a lot in the media about multiculturalism in Korea, that there's more and more in migration to Korea. There's since the turn of the century, 21st century, there's been a constant kind of ongoing narrative, sometimes a little bit panicked, in the Korean media about, an influx of foreign brides and especially laborers from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this narrative of, there's more and more and more and more foreigners in Korea. And at the same time, the Korean birth rate famously is has been dropping drastically over the past decade. So there's an issue of, two-part. On the one hand, an increasing number of foreign bodies, at the same time that there is like literally a decreasing number of Korean bodies. So kind of very similar to these, my favorite in the US, we get these Time Magazine New Year's articles every so often that'll be these like composite pictures of different colored faces in the US, and they all end up showing kind of a brown mass. And they're like, this is what we're all going to look like in 200 years, an immigrant nation, we're all going to like come together and we'll all be like a brown person in the end. Like that's not how it works. Don't worry. These kind of covers that are intended to rise up and panic a sort of a reactionary conservative base. You get the same kind of coverage in Korea. And the thing is, I don't think that to me, that kind of confirms the legacy of this history is still going strong. I don't really see the intense public interest and the concern and the panic over what the proper route towards Korea's future is racially. I don't see the fact that race is such a point of interest as a mark of like moving away from this legacy. I see it as very much the opposite. I think it is a direct result of these histories that came before. And it's just kind of trying to, I don't know that it's even trying to adapt to the new reality. I think, there are some people who frame multiculturalism very much as Korea needs to embrace a more sort of like immigration focused way of composing itself as a country. But even that word adapt to me is a bit like, it's acknowledging implicitly or saying like we need to make a shift and it's pretending that Korea has always been a monoracial country. Like we've been monoracial, but we can't afford to be anymore. And so we need to adapt. And to me, that continues to buy into a myth. And particularly, for example, in light of the history with regards to mixed race children that we just mentioned, again, well-meaning proponents of a more multicultural Korea in the past 2 decades, have been running these campaigns where they'll have pictures of mixed race children of, say, like Vietnamese brides and Korean men in the countryside. Particularly the agricultural parts of Korea have a lot of these kind of mixed marriages today. So they'll have these photos of these kids and they say, like, I also am Korean is this sort of motto line, which on the one hand, you're like, great, you're finally accepting mixed race Koreans. But at the same time, like I will say to me personally, as a mixed Korean, especially one who studies this history, it reads as incredibly exploitative to me that only now that you as a country are not producing enough pure blood children to work the farm fields and you need these children to do the agricultural labor that pure blood Koreans aren't doing because they're moving to cities and working for Samsung and Hyundai. Only now that you need them are they also Korean. So I will say that, that question of legacy for me, I use the word, so I should take responsibility for it. I'm not even sure it's legacy. I think it's it's a direct continuation of this same history and of these same sort of narratives.
Mm-hmm. And just the last question I have before we wrap up, if someone's listening to this and they want to know more about this notion of purity of race or mixed blood Koreans, or just this general uh, anything general about this topic, what would be one or two books that you would recommend?
Oh, there are a lot of good books. So I think I will lay out like four good standards, and I think most of them are pretty accessible for a wide readership. Um, so the first two very solidly kind of deal with the colonial era that I referenced a few times, and most of what's been written about Korean identity and Korean national consciousness in English focuses on the colonial era. There's not as much written about the post 1945 period. So the first is by Hyung-il Pai, um, and it is about essentially how Korean archaeologists constructed a sort of a narrative of Koreanness by looking into the past, doing these archaeological constructions and trying to figure out in a past period when Korea didn't even exist as a state, how do you define sort of like Korean bodies based on these excavations? How do you define Korean civilization based on these excavations? Oh, what is like the origins of Koreanness or something like that. Sorry, titles are not my forte. The other colonial period one, Andre Schmid's book. I think he's only got the one, so it should be easy to look up. Korea Between Empires. And he's dealing with this sort of transitional period between the last independent Korean kingdom and the Japanese colonial period, and looking at these sort of narratives of transition and how intellectuals, particularly during this period, are trying to come up with a sense of Koreanness. Moving forward into the post 1945 period, Kyuk Shin's book, Ethnic Nationalism in Korea, classic, very readable, wonderful, wonderful study that I think has something for everyone. He deals with the colonial period, he deals with the post-colonial period, he does historical work, he does like kind of more ethnographic, survey-based work. So whatever your nerd streak is, there's something in that book for you. And then the last one, which is it is the most recent, is Unjong Kim's Curative Violence. And she has like written a beautiful study. Each chapter looks at a different aspect of Korean identity as organized around race, as organized around gender, sexuality. She herself is a disabilities studies scholar, so she looks at that question of disabled bodies in Korea and is very engaged with the question of eugenics that you brought up. And so she's tracking all of these questions across each chapter is basically a little snapshot of like 100 years historically, from the colonial period all the way through the present. And she's looking at, everything. It's a little bit historical, it's a little bit anthropology, it's a little bit media studies, really beautifully written kind of conglomeration of these different disciplinary interests.
Great. Inga, thank you for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And this is, I should say, a fantastic idea. And I wish you all the best with the rest of this season.
Thank you. And for those in the audience who are interested in seeing more content, you can go to our YouTube channel, the What is Asia podcast, or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.